Well, we're going to conclude today. Maybe a rehearsal next week of all the hand signs. We're going through, walk through the Bible, the history of Christianity in the New Testament. So we're walking through the history. So we're going to go from the beginning. So if everybody can stand up, and then now many of you might not understand if you're new, might not understand it. Maybe next week we can go over some of those. Okay. It all starts before the birth of Jesus. It starts with Greece, language. Israel, hopes. Rome, roads. After all that, then the birth of Jesus, birth. Okay? Baptized by John, tempted by Satan, second birth. He's in Israel, Jerusalem at this point. And then women at the well. Women at the well. Rejection, selection. He rejected in Nazareth, okay? And then he goes to Jordan. He is baptized by John, and then tempted by Satan, and then second birth, and then women at the well, and then rejection, selection, and then parables, miracles. And then there's a testimony of Peter. Peter says that Jesus is the Lord. Transfiguration, then counting the cost, seeking the lost, and then Lazarus raised, Zacchaeus praised. Then we get to Holy Week on Sunday, triumphal entry. Then there's temple cleansing on Monday, Last Supper on Thursday. Okay, then Thursday night, Jesus goes to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then he is betrayed. Okay, so then we are now to Friday morning, all right? He is tried before Pontius Pilate. He is denied, and then he is crucified. Resurrected. Let's say it again. Resurrection. Okay, then he is ascended. The Spirit, then community, and then servant leaders, and then Stephen, and then the persecution happens, led by Paul. Persecution, okay? Philip's preaching, Paul's conversion, Peter's vision, and then first journey, law. Okay, so Paul spends a lot of time in modern-day Turkey, okay? And he is mainly battling legalism from the Jews because at this point, Christianity is still a Jewish religion, okay? And then, after his journey, he goes to the council, all right, in Jerusalem. So, council, and they say, you don't have to get circumcised, so it's grace. So, council, grace. Second journey, call. Paul wants to spend his time still in Asia Minor, but God calls Paul to Europe, to go to Greece. Okay? So, second journey, call. Third journey, build. And then he is back in Jerusalem, tried. Fourth journey, he's in Rome, he's imprisoned. Apostles speak. Wait, Christ. All right, sit down. All right, so if you go to the maps, let's start with the first journey as we finish up. All right, so Antioch is the home base. It is the fourth largest city in the Roman Empire. And it is, as you can see in all of Paul's journey, God and Paul are very strategic. Thank you. All right, God and Paul are very strategic about where Paul spends his time. Paul wants to, so Paul is going out. He's teaming up with Barnabas and John Mark. John Mark is a very young man. He later becomes the scribe, probably, to Peter, and then eventually becomes the bishop of Alexandria. That's what church tradition says, which is the second largest city. But they make their round mainly around southern Galatia. Okay, Paul comes back. he's fighting the Jewish Christians and who's insisting that it stay very Jewish. And you still need to be circumcised to be a Christian. So he comes back and writes Galatians, saying, you're saved by faith alone. And Martin Luther picks that up later in the during the Reformation. But, okay, next. Paul goes on a second missionary journey. He teams up with Silas, still Antioch. And he is wanting to now establish, he probably has Ephesus in mind, but God gives him a call to say, don't go to Ephesus right now, or don't stay in Asia Minor, but go to Europe. So on his way, though, he picks up Timothy. Timothy is probably around 18 or 20. So in his first missionary journey, that's probably where Timothy got saved. So Paul and Silas goes to Lystra, picks up Timothy, a very young man at the time, and then he goes to Troas and picks up Luke, who eventually becomes his lifelong partner and the historian to the Bible, to Christianity. And then he goes to Philippi and then meets with Lydia, who really then becomes a main character in that city. And then to Thessalonica. He's routed out of Thessalonica very violently and very abruptly. So he has to leave very quickly. But he eventually makes himself a way to Corinth, where he spends 18 months. So he spends a lot of time in Corinth and plants the church, really, in Corinth. That's where he meets Aquila and Priscilla, who are tent makers. And so Paul becomes a tent maker, or he was already a tent maker, but he re-engages in that trade because he's there a very long time. And so he stays there for 18 months. But that's also where he writes his second letter, which is Thessalonians. And then he writes another letter, 2 Thessalonians, while in Corinth, because he was abruptly chased out of Thessalonica. And so you're beginning to see the formation of the letters of Paul. Next. All right, his third missionary journey. Now, this time, Timothy is a little older. He still takes Luke and probably Titus, and they leave on that journey. But this time, he eventually makes it to Ephesus, and he spends about 3 years planting the church in Ephesus. Ephesus is the third largest city in the Roman Empire. Oh, by the way, Corinth, during his second missionary journey, is probably around 4th or 5th largest city in the Roman Empire. And Ephesus is the third largest city, and he spends 3 years there. Then while in Ephesus, he still has Corinth in mind. While he's there, he writes 1 Corinthians. And then he travels, after 3 years, he travels to Philippi and probably writes 2 Corinthians in advance of him revisiting Corinth, because he wants to go back to the church he planted. Then eventually gets there. Now, they discourage him from going back to Jerusalem. Now, during his entire missionary journey, because the Jerusalem church is very, very poor. So during his entire journey, he collects money, and probably lots of it, so that he can take it all back to Jerusalem. So a lot of prophecies, don't go back to Jerusalem. Paul, you're going to get killed. Well, what does he do? He goes back to Jerusalem, okay? And there, they're saying, hey, they're going to kill you, so, you gotta do this and you got to do that. So let's go to the next slide. So Paul's in Jerusalem, and they're about to kill him. There's a plot. There are about 40 men they take a vow. They're not going to eat or drink until Paul is killed. Now, Paul's sister's son overhears the plot and then tells the Roman commander about the plot. So the Roman commander then takes Paul and takes him to Caesarea. Caesarea is the Roman capital for the Judean region. So that's where the Roman governor lives. That's where Pilate lived. And now, right now, it's Felix. So Governor Felix now has to try Paul. Now, Governor Felix throws Paul into prison for 2 years. So Paul has been in Caesarea for 2 years. During this time, Paul is, the governorship is changed from Felix to Festus. And now Festus brings Paul after taking over the governorship, and now wants to try Paul. And what Felix wanted was really a bribe from Paul, thinking that, because Paul collected a lot of money. I don't know what he heard, but Paul didn't have any money. He opted to stay in jail. And then Festus is wanting to send him back to Jerusalem. He doesn't want anything to do with it. Paul gets wind of that. And so then Paul says, I want to appeal to Caesar, send me to Rome. Okay? And so then Paul, they have no choice but to send Paul to Rome at this point, rather than go back to Jerusalem where people will plot to kill him. So this is all the providence of God. So then Paul then sails, he goes up to Sidon, and then ships out on a merchant ship. He has Luke with him. I don't know how they allowed Luke to go with him, but he is with him, always faithful to the end. And then they go by Crete. The ship goes by Crete. It's probably supply routes. All right, that's kind of important because after, anyways, I'll explain later. So he goes to Crete, but he doesn't really do any ministry there, by the way. He gets shipwrecked in Malta, but eventually makes his way to Rome. He is under house arrest for 2 years. And during that prison, he writes 4 letters: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Okay? And the first 3 are in that order. So when we next week or in the week following, when we are memorizing the books of the Bible, that's good to know. Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, Paul writes from prison during his first imprisonment. Colossians and Philemon are written together. Philemon is an elder at the church of Colossae, and Paul is writing Philemon on behalf of a slave that ran away from Philemon, and Paul's now telling him to take him back as a friend, not as a slave, which is very, very revolutionary during that time. Okay? So all of this is happening while Paul is arrested in Rome. Paul's eventually released, and we know a couple of places that Paul goes to. Paul goes back to Europe, specifically the modern-day Greece, and he goes back to Crete for whatever reason. And then he leaves Titus in Crete after the imprisonment. And that's why you have the letter of Titus. And then also after this, Timothy is also deployed to Ephesus after a few years. And Timothy is now the lead pastor at Ephesus. At this point, he's in his probably early 30s, maybe 30, 31, 32, around that age. But he is pastoring as a very young man, and Titus also a very young man. And so then later on, then you have the pastoral epistles. Okay, so that is the wrap. Then after Paul finishes letters, you also now, during that time, you have the letters, what we call the general epistles. When we say apostles speak, all right, the book of Hebrews. Then you have the book of the elders of the Jerusalem church that they wrote. So you got Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, then 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. All right, Jude is another brother of James. He writes the book, and then you have Revelations. Okay? All right, let's pray. Oh, actually, before we pray, I think we can let's start from his missionary journey. All right? All right. First journey, law. Counsel, grace. Second journey, call. Third journey, build. Trials. Fourth journey, Rome. Apostles speak, wait, Christ. Sit down. Thank you.